afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to today's tech talk on innovative molecular bonds in clean energy. We are joined today by Dr. Pradeep Chhabra from the Carbon Containment Lab and Dr. Colin Rooney from Oxylus Energy. And today's discussion is being moderated by Eleanor Stewart-Jones. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Yeah, we're really excited to have Connor and Pete here to talk about their work in Carbon Containment Labs and Oxylus Energy. I don't necessarily want to introduce them because they prepared some slides to introduce themselves, a little bit about their work, why it's important, and what the problems are. So I'm actually going to hand it off to Pete so he can go through his slides. Okay. Just to give an outline for how this is going to go, each of them are going to present a few slides. We're going to have a Q&A session between the three of us, and then we're going to try to allow for a lot of time for audience questions towards the end. So we're really excited to see what insights and what thoughts you guys have. Thank you.
Great, thanks everybody. I've maybe 9 or 10 slides, so I'm going to have to rush through these to get through the 5-minute time limit, but happy to talk about these after or answer any questions about it. So first I'm going to go over kind of my personal journey, how I ended up at the Carbon Containment Lab. And so I guess I will start with where I was born and raised. I was born and raised in the Chicago suburbs. And then from there, went to state school at University of Illinois. I really liked chemistry and math, so I did chemical engineering and mathematics. What really got me into sustainability is I had an internship at Clean Air Engineering, which was a permitting agency outside of Chicago, and they did Clean Air Act Title V permitting for various different industries. And so while the science was very interesting, going to work every day in an office was not very interesting. So I decided to do my PhD and went straight to Caltech to study further into atmospheric chemistry and particular organic aerosol. And I worked in the lab looking at aerosol formed in smog chambers. Defended my thesis in 2011. After that, decided to do some postdoctoral research, thinking that being a professor would be a really cool thing to do. And so I first did research at Aerodyne Research, looking at, again, more mass spec chemistry research into aerosols. So I started at Aerodyne Research for about a few years, then moved to University of Texas at Austin. And at about the 4th year of doing a postdoc, I was like, okay, maybe this isn't where I really want to be, and then moved to industry, where I became a scientist at Perkin-Elmer, and I researched gas chromatography, and particularly in applications of atmospheric science and air toxics. And then my business unit got carved out into private equity right when I started at the Yale School of Management to do my executive MBA, so it was kind of fortuitous. I got to understand what private equity was while going through it. And then graduated in May and found out about the Carbon Containment Lab and joined them as a principal in July. And so happy to talk about that more offline or afterwards. So quickly, motivation. I think everybody here kind of understands the motivation. Due to us putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we're seeing warming. And that warming is causing a lot of devastating events. And you see this graph goes up to 2023 and doesn't count the devastating events that we just had, Hurricane Helene and Milton. So I don't think I have to go through that much further. But we know what the cause is. We know that we're putting all these greenhouse gases, some are very long-lived in the atmosphere, some are very short-lived in the atmosphere. The shortest-lived ones, but also the most potent ones, are HFCs. But also methane's a very potent gas, and of course everybody's familiar with CO2 increasing now to well past 420 ppm. So what do we do with the Carbon Containment Lab? Well, our mission is to develop and try to scale emergent climate solutions using our scientific expertise, entrepreneurial knowledge, and our investment background with several folks in our group. So we focus on carbon containment, so we're primarily focused on carbon mitigation and greenhouse gas mitigation, as well as the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere and storage. So we look at projects across short-term goals and long-term goals, and I'll get more into that. And then we try to focus on unbiased scientific research that is economically, and look into projects that are economically feasible so that these problems can actually scale and be put into industry and actually, see them come about. So we really try to rally all the stakeholders that are necessary for any kind of projects or pathways that we're looking into, and we have a big focus on education, putting white papers out on our website so we can get these ideas out into the real world, and we also try to monitor our progress and benchmark them against our mitigation goals. And so our goals can be divided into two types of strategies. One we call like the sprint strategy, and one we call the marathon strategy. The sprint strategy is primarily aligned with our non-CO2 focus, and that's what we call, that's within our anthropogenic program, where we look at methane and HFCs. And our goal by 2030 is to reduce or avoid 100 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030. That having a 20-year, looking at gases that have a 20-year global warming potential, and look at the average cost of about 25 metric tons of CO2 or less. And then the long-term strategy is focused on a geologic program and a biologic program, and that's looking at ways to durably storing CO2, either under trap rock or using kind of a biker's method of carbon removal. And then again, we have a goal of 1 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalent, also including the 100 million, but now looking at an average cost of $75 per ton. And so we kind of look at this from a systemic point of view. I like to call this the net zero value chain or the net zero value system, in which we kind of want to look all across this system and accelerate the processes that can make this happen. So one of the processes, do we have a zero laser pointer on this? Probably not. Anyway, so one of the ideas is that we can take biomass that captures CO2 and bury it underground. That's terrestrial biomass storage. Or we can take that low-value biomass and try to gasify it, and turn that into useful energy products, and then take whatever CO2 comes out of these processes, store that, again, either in terrestrial storage or in geologic storage. And so we work across many geographies, and we realize that it requires a lot of different stakeholders to make this happen. You have to engage policymakers, you have to engage landowners, indigenous peoples, the public, industries, different markets, to get these solutions to accelerate. And so what's important to note here is we're working across a whole geography, and not just in Connecticut, even though we're based in Connecticut and we spun out of Yale. And then this is our team, and we have expertise that goes across geology, ecology, engineering, investment, finance, entrepreneurship, and I just want to note that we're hiring, and so if you're interested in joining our group, we're just 2 blocks down, and please give us a ring or send us an email. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much for that introduction.
Yeah.
All right, let's shift over to some of Connor's slides. And also thank you, Varun, for working the tech here. Okay.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Connor. It's really a pleasure to be here on this panel. I was a student attending this conference the last few years, so it was a quick upgrade. But yeah, excited to tell you a little bit about myself, my journey. I didn't prepare as beautiful of a slide about my journey, so I'll just talk you through it very quickly. But I was raised in Montana, near Glacier National Park. Kind of loved the outdoors from that upbringing, and went to California for my undergraduate, studied chemistry at Pomona College. That's where I got my first taste working in a chemistry lab. Really fell in love with chemistry research. Decided to go and stay in school and do my PhD here at Yale. And at that point, I was interested in, how can we use chemistry to solve some of these climate challenges, something along that net zero value chain that Puneet just described. So I started working with Professor Hai-Ling Wang here at Yale Energy Science Institute, Department of Chemistry, on how to convert CO2 into liquid fuels. So I'll talk a little bit about why this is a technology worth investigating and deploying. And so that was the focus of my PhD, and then it morphed into a startup company, which I'll go into more later too, so I won't talk too much about it right now. But before we do that, let me go into why we need alternative fuels and green molecules, which hopefully will set the stage for this discussion. First of all, let me say that electrification, I think, is a really great strategy to decarbonize a lot of our economy. So we're getting better and better at renewable energy generation, right? Solar and wind, among others. There are some challenges with intermittency or interconnectedness, but I'm really optimistic that we'll be able to solve these, with policy and technology. And everything that we can electrify, we should, right? Whether it's battery EVs, heat pumps, grid storage. But then there are some sectors where we just really can't use this strategy. And I think these sort of, so-called hard-to-abate sectors are where we need green molecules the most. So in this kind of plot on the left side, this is annual US emissions, CO2 emissions, for about 5 gigatons a year. And this projection is like, how much could we decarbonize with different technologies? You can see the blue, the green, the red. These are all like electrified solutions, right? So renewable energy generation, so green electrons, green, single or passenger vehicles, electrified industrial heat. But then there's that like purple, sort of band there that's, leaves us with about 1.5 gigatons that we can't electrify, and we really need zero carbon fuels or low carbon molecules to decarbonize. And so what I really think about these zero carbon fuels is that they need 3 kind of key characteristics. One, they obviously need to be produced via clean pathways. I mean, that seems obvious enough, but it actually can be pretty complicated. And I know the Carbon Containment Lab does a lot of really good work, for example, in life cycle analysis, really understanding what is the emission profile for a decarbonized solution. Is it really decarbonized? Secondly, it needs to be scalable, right? Like this is a gigaton scale, so we need technologies that scale, and they need to make that impact, and they need to do it at a cost that people can afford so that it gets adopted. And then lastly, it needs to be compatible with the infrastructure that we have in our economy today, right? You can have really good technology that's really good cost, low cost, but no one's going to adopt it if they need to spend millions or billions of dollars to upgrade their whole fleet. So these are the green molecules that I think are really key to industrial decarbonization. Well, I guess batteries aren't a molecule, but hydrogen, ammonia, or methanol. These 3 get a lot of attention, and they all have kind of advantages and disadvantages. With hydrogen or ammonia, there's no CO2 there, right? There's no carbon. So that's a big advantage in terms of, if we're going to burn hydrogen, it just makes water, so we don't need to worry about emissions, from burning hydrogen. In the case of methanol, if we're going to burn methanol, it's still going to emit CO2. So that means the methanol that we create needs to be coming from captured CO2 that was in the atmosphere already, right? So I won't spend too much time on this for the sake of time, but I would love, to talk more about, each of these in depth in the discussion. But really, my point is there's no silver bullet here. Each of these, molecules has a role to play. I'm a big fan of methanol. Oxylus Energy makes renewable methanol, so that's our sort of angle. But I'm also a believer in ammonia and hydrogen, right, for different applications. The challenge with hydrogen is the transportation and storage. So on-site utilization is often the best if you can produce and consume on-site. Ammonia, I think, will have an important role in maritime decarbonization, and then, of course, for fertilizers. But then e-fuels, what I'll spend the rest of the time talking about, are where we take CO2 from point source or from the atmosphere and convert it into liquid fuels. So that's what we do at Oxylus Energy. And the demand for these e-fuels is growing really rapidly, but the supply is super constrained. There's just not a lot of this on the market, and the stuff that is on the market is 3 or 4 times the price of the fossil alternative. So it's really hard for folks to stomach, paying that green premium. And so what we need are more efficient production pathways that can get the cost down, with the help, of course, of the right policy. And it's a huge market opportunity, right? Not only should we do this for our, for Earth, but we also should do it from an economic standpoint, in that, it's like 10% of emissions and, about $1 trillion, more than $1 trillion of the market opportunities if you can make scalable, affordable e-fuels. And so this process that Oxylus does and e-fuels use is to take CO2 from a point source, from the atmosphere, together with renewable energy and water, combine these 3 inputs, ideally using efficient technology into that liquid fuel. To give the Oxylus pitch, I had to do it one slide. The way that we do this is in a one-step process, and so the value here is, typically the way to produce renewable methanol is you need to first make green hydrogen, you then need to react green hydrogen with CO2 to make syngas, which is carbon monoxide and hydrogen, and then you need to further upgrade that to methanol. So that's a lot of sort of capital expense, and it's pretty low energy efficiency. So if we can combine all of this into one step, one electrochemical reactor that takes CO2 and water in and makes liquid fuel, liquid methanol out. So that's what we're developing. We started at Yale, so to go kind of to our journey, and hopefully this is useful for the students in the room. I was a PhD student here. I was working on this technology, and we made some really good progress. But I knew, not a lick about entrepreneurship. And so I started spending some time at the Center for Entrepreneurship at Yale, which is actually where I met my co-founders. They were students at the School of Management and the School of the Environment. And so they really, taught me what it takes to build a business. And together, we started this. First, we got some funding from SciCity, allowed us to build our first prototypes, do customer discovery, really build a foundation of a business. And then, we kind of chipped away at it, and then by the time we graduated, we were able to raise some capital to move into our own space. Now we have a team of 6. We're working in Brantford, Connecticut, so just 15 minutes down the road. And, really grateful for the support, that the Yale and Connecticut community has provided us. One of our investors is Connecticut Innovations. That's, been just a big supporter for us, provided, not only the capital, but also a lot of mentorship for myself and my co-founders. This is our team. I'm the least impressive person on the slide, and so, that's probably the best advice is find smarter and, more talented people and surround yourself with them. So that's all I have, and happy to chat more.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for the introduction. I think it's really great to hear about both of your, paths through your education, your PhDs, what followed, and then to hear about the impact of the government containment labs and Oxylus. Really great context. So I think to start off, I wanted to go kind of broad at the beginning and ask some parallel questions, and then we can get more into the specifics. But Carbon Containment Lab, so you guys are trying to de-risk investment in new technologies.
Yep.
I wanted to ask if you could talk about how, well, first, why is that important? And how do you judge what technologies or developments are worth de-risking? And then, not necessarily a follow-up, but maybe a parallel question to that is you guys have just had a really successful, funding cycle with Oxylus. Can you talk about how you communicated the advancements that you guys are working on and what that was like? So maybe let's begin in carbon containment.
So your first question was, why is de-risking needed? And I think for those of you that work in kind of the deep tech space and in climate tech space, you maybe heard the term the valley of death, where it's you start with a prototype, you've maybe got a bench scale, but then moving to a pilot and commercial scale, there's just a huge pit of what can go wrong, and mostly of that is financing, technical risk, permitting, policy, all these different issues that come into play. And so we try to look at that whole ecosystem and find out where the biggest risks are and try to mitigate those risks, either putting out papers or matchmaking and bringing various different stakeholders together. So an example of that would be the refrigerants work that we've been doing, and that's a bit tangentially related to the energy conference. But if you're working on decarbonizing buildings, you have to think about refrigerants. And so right now there really isn't, in the United States and much of the world, there really isn't an infrastructure for recycling and destroying HFCs. So how do we build that infrastructure? How do we get the players together so that there's an incentive for either reclamation of HFCs or destruction of them? And so that'll be working with policymakers, working with international players, with the Montreal Protocol and the Paris Agreement. It's also working at small industry players that are looking into the space, either generating carbon credits or trying to resell that reclamation. So it's bringing those people together so that we can actually create these ecosystems that would make this useful for all parties. And then your second question was,
you talked about the importance. How do you and your team sort of judge what is worth investing or what is worth de-risking?
Right. So that slide I put up earlier, we kind of see our strategy as both the sprint and the marathon. So when we look at the sprint, we look at those molecules and the global warming potential that can have the biggest bang for our buck. And so that's looking at a cost of $25 per metric ton. And so that really constrains kind of the solutions we want to look at, and that gives us direction. And so we want to look at, first, is there economic feasibility, but then also is there social acceptance for these kind of things, and then is there technological solutions that already exist or are maybe at, let's say, TRL 5 or 6, and they just need the right push, either from investment or from DOE grants that would really get this across the finish line. Yeah. So definitely look at it holistically from different buckets, to really see what makes the most sense and what doesn't.
Yeah. No, I think that's an awesome perspective to think about how your team approaches this. So in terms of Oxylus, could you talk, again, just to repeat the questions, about how did you communicate the importance of this to venture capital to actually get investment into the company to get it off the ground?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and fundraising isn't easy, but I think going to that slide I showed earlier where there's kind of three key traits that really broadly climate technology, climate hardware needs, right? It needs to be it needs to be clean, right? So the inputs and the process needs to be low carbon. So that's like life cycle analysis, right? So you need to have really strong life cycle analysis. And secondly, it needs to be scalable and reach, cost competition with whatever, the incumbent technology is. In our case, it's especially hard because the price of methanol is 50 cents per liter. So it's a tough number to beat, but what you need is a really good techno-economic assessment, right? It's a really strong techno-economic assessment that shows what are the assumptions, what needs to come true for you to reach cost parity, and investors have different theses and beliefs on where the price of energy is going to go, or the price of CO2. But you just want to create a model that they can play with, and that shows like, all right, these are the technical metrics. These are where we need to go for this to be economically viable, or for and then lastly, is something that's a little bit less in your control, but that's the infrastructure side, right? And a big sell for us is that green methanol. It's already methanol broadly is produced 100 million metric tons per year. We know what to do with it. We know how to upgrade it. There's a whole infrastructure for transportation and upgrading, and so we can plug right into that. In terms of like the sort of granular details of fundraising, it's a lot about building the relationship and track record, I think. And for us, the folks that ended up leading our round, we met 6 months before we closed the deal, and so it was really in the first conversation showing them like, all right, this is where we are, this is where we want to get to, and then a month later, this is the progress we've made, and then a month later, this is how much progress we've made, and then they can start drawing the sort of connecting the dots and seeing what the trajectory is. And so I think that made a big difference, is showing them that we could execute, even if it's just for a few months, building that relationship, and so they can kind of trust in you. If they give you capital that you can kind of go and execute, it makes a big difference.
Yeah.
And I'd like to second the techno-economic assessment and the LCA. I mean, that's a huge part of the reducing that technical risk of if we identify a possible solution, we want to make sure, well, does this actually reduce the carbon, or is it just an actual gain, and we're not thinking about it the right way? So, yeah.
No, thank you. So you both have, I think, touched on different points of this, but I think I'd like to kind of break to the fore for a little bit more discussion. Moving to a net zero, like carbon economy, like that is incredibly challenging, and you've talked about some of the issues that are stopping us from getting there. In terms of finding technology that's compatible with existing infrastructure, in terms of getting investment early on, could you sketch out some of those problems a little bit more? I think I'm specifically thinking about, if you're making methanol, you've talked about the challenge of having a startup where you're making a commodity chemical that's already somewhat cheap. And there's this huge infrastructure that is really great at, making syngas from one source already. We've also spoken about the possibility of getting syngas from different biomass sources. But I think having that be, a concept is one thing, but implementing it is very, very hard. So could you talk through some of the challenges there?
Sure, yeah, I can start with, for us, it's really like a step-by-step thing. And going back to the fundraising thing is, you need investors, especially in the hard tech, deep tech space, that are going to be patient, right? This isn't the type of thing, it's not like a SaaS play where, next year, we're going viral. So, it takes time. You got to build, prototypes. Obviously, we want to iterate quickly, but, putting a pilot in the ground takes time and money. And so, but ideally, you can do that in a way that de-risks the science in, a sort of iterative process, right? So you can maybe de-risk the most fundamental properties of whatever your technology is first. And the first pilot doesn't need to be huge, but hopefully that shows like, okay, in our case, for example, the catalyst we've developed, like it works, right? It can work for long enough, selectively enough. Like that's the most important thing. And then the next thing is like, okay, can this be integrated into a system, right? And like those things don't need to all happen at once. It just, kind of start with the most fundamental things that differentiate your technology, try and de-risk them, and then, build up. And ideally you can build, 10x, 100x scale up each time. And I think that's the playbook that I've seen from other folks be successful, and we're trying to emulate.
Yeah. So a lot of the solutions that we tend to look at are ones that are not big deep tech, big ideas, but ones that already exist, but maybe they need acceleration, or maybe they just need to be applied in a different way. And so you mentioned gasification. And so we look at gasification as a possible solution to woody biomass. In the West, woody biomass is being cleared from forests to reduce the fire risk, but normally they'll just take that and pile it up where it decomposes, and often they just burn it, so you've lost that free energy. So if we can take gasification, which is a technology that has existed since the early 1900s, if you know the history, the Axis powers used it to convert coal into diesel. And so currently it's being used in a number of countries, but more for low quality power and for heat. If we can take, let's say, gasification of woody biomass and convert it to, let's say, syngas, and then from syngas use like a Fischer-Tropsch process with water gas shift, you can make some high-value fuels like either methanol or maybe even SAF is a fuel we're looking at. So these technologies already exist. Fischer-Tropsch and all these unit processes already exist. How can we scale this up, particularly in the United States? Now, the main challenge in the United States is regulatory, getting permitting, and then figuring out the supply chain. Where do you get the woody biomass? How do you plug it into the distribution points, right? And there have been trials of trying to get this going, but I think, working with the right players and having the right idea from the start really matters. Yeah.
And then I also just wanted to ask, you talked about the project with the wood biomass.
Yep.
Could each of you talk about something that's currently going on in each of your respective ventures that you're very excited about?
Yep.
And then something that's maybe on the forefront in the next few years, maybe a specific project or a specific space you're looking to break into that you're looking forward to?
Want to start?
Yeah, so one of the projects I just worked on, and Leah Clayton, who's in the audience, she's one of the major kind of researchers behind it, is looking at terrestrial storage of biomass, so taking out this cleared biomass, low quality wood, and then just storing it underground. And so the basic idea is we want to slow decomposition and slow the effluence of greenhouse gases. And so we've got a project where we're trying to do that with different types of woody biomass and measuring what's coming out of that, making sure that we can get anaerobic decomposition that's very slow and in a very dry environment. And so that's one project that I've assisted with it, and that's a 5-year ongoing project, and we're hopefully going to get data over these 5 years to kind of keep track of how durable that carbon is in underground.
That's really great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the thing that is most exciting that we're doing right now is we brought on 2 more folks in August, and so it's been a couple months, and that's like really accelerated our progress. One of them, Cheyenne, is in the audience, and so actually came from Caltech, so another Caltech Beaver connection. But yeah, I think that's been really awesome for us to have 2 more PhD scientists helping us develop the technology. And then from a kind of customer discovery or customer development standpoint, started having conversations around some of the more high-value petrochemicals that we can upgrade our methanol into, which we can go into more, but I think that is a really great strategy for companies like us to, to really hit like a more higher margin, low volume product as you sort of scale up the technology towards the bigger volume, lower margin markets like maritime, for example. And so methanol, for example, is used as a solvent. There's pharmaceutical companies we've been speaking to that are more willing to pay a green premium for decarbonized solvent. Or, for example, methanol to polypropylene. So there's some consumer plastics that want to decarbonize. Think folks like Lego. And so these are just 2 examples of, I think customer segments that Oxylus is really excited about working with.
No, that's really good to hear. I'm very excited, especially about this buried wood project. I know we've chatted a little bit about it. That's just so cool.
Yeah, it's really cool.
So thinking about, I think, both of your backgrounds, you're both scientists, you both have PhDs, you're both having to communicate with shareholders, maybe with customers, with folks you're working with who don't necessarily have a science background, and you're trying to communicate the importance of your work, maybe the importance of the technology, maybe how the technology works. Could you speak a little bit about your experience with that, how you've tried to navigate that?
I'll say, like, when I put the slide about my path, I kind of showed that the path was a bit tortuous, but I actually think that that was helpful in the end because I've had now experience in academia, in industry, now our Carbon Containment Lab is a nonprofit, and also, you know, with the Yale MBA, and then also working a little bit with startups. Having that varied experience gave me like a large vocabulary. And so I think that's what, even though the path wasn't a straight line of graduating, getting my PhD, coming up with a great idea, it did help me communicate with various different people with various different backgrounds. Yeah.
No, I could see how the path would have been helpful for
Yeah.
that end.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still learning, right?
You just need a torturous path.
Yeah, well, no, I would suggest, it's rough too, so, you know, if you got the great idea, go for it.
No, but I think, you know, I think a big part of this is, it's the type of thing where, like, the more you learn, the less you realize you actually know, right? And I definitely feel that. And then I think it's, like, surrounding yourself with experts, you know, whether it's your team, you know, people that are really capable that you can learn from, or advisors, like, you know, been fortunate to have some great mentors, you know, at Yale and outside. So I think if you're, like, you know, willing to learn and, you know, sort of go out of your way to try and make these connections, there's a lot of people that are really excited about climate tech and willing, you know, and have, you know, really strong knowledge bases that can help a venture like ours, and we've benefited from that. And so, you know, for other entrepreneurs out there, you know, that's probably a superpower that you can easily tap into, is just, like, you know, messaging people, especially when you're a student. People love the student pitch, you know, like, I'm a graduate student, like, can you know, take 30 minutes to talk to me? You know, if you do that, you can learn a lot, and then you can make some really valuable, build some valuable relationships.
I think both of you, in some of the conversations we had to prepare for this, really spoke about the importance of your respective teams and how great both of your teams have been, and, you know, working across different projects, different areas to bring it all together. Okay, so we have, I think, about 25 minutes left, and we want to have plenty of time for audience questions. So I think the room is sort of small enough that you can just raise your hand, and I'll do my best to call on you as I see you. Okay, we have a question over here. Hi.
Thank you. Liquid fuels from non-carbon, non-fossil, sources, where would those be most applicable? Something like aviation? And is there a trajectory by which it will become cost competitive with what will it take to make it cost competitive? Will it be purely from doing it better, or will there be a need for carbon pricing, etc., things like that? How do you make it fully adopted?
That's a really great question. Yeah, starting with, you know, the sort of where it's needed the most, aviation is probably top of that list, right? And so when we think of airplanes, you know, the kerosene, Jet A fuel goes into those. It's really hard to go away from that. You know, the planes that are being built today are going to be in the sky for the next 30 years. You know, we're probably not going to, like, change the whole fleet of airplanes, so we need to make that same fuel decarbonized. And so I think in that case, it really makes sense to make SAF from captured CO2. And then, you know, maybe next in line is maritime. So maritime shipping, you know, that one from sort of cost perspective is even harder to compete than aviation. Aviation, there's at least, you know, it's a slightly higher value fuel compared to maritime. Or maritime, traditionally, it's been like, you know, the, excuse my language, but the crap that comes out of the refinery, you know, is what they put into the ship, right? And so that, like, heavy fuel oil. But there's a push now for methanol, and so methanol is the simplest liquid you can make from CO2, and so, you know, in terms of, like, probably the easiest, cheapest liquid hydrocarbon, that's going to be methanol. So for maritime, I think that's going to be the winner. And then in terms of getting down to cost parity and what needs to come true, you know, the biggest part of the cost structure for any e-fuel company, somewhere between 50 and 70% of the cost is going to be the electricity. So it takes a bunch of energy to drive this reaction. At best, it's like 50% energy efficiency. So, if you put 1 watt of energy into the process, you'll get maybe half a watt of chemical energy in the fuel. So it's a pretty bad battery when you think of it that way. But what you need is obviously very green and reliable renewable electricity. And so that can be, it depends who you talk to. Obviously, I'm pretty optimistic that renewable electricity will become cheaper and more available, and higher capacity factor, as we have more sort of, short-term storage. But that, for the first projects, does put a location, bound, where you need somewhere that's got a lot of solar or a lot of wind with high capacity. And then typically, we're looking at below 5 cents per kilowatt hour, where the cost sort of competitiveness with fossil comes in. And probably even below that, around 2 or 3 cents per kilowatt hour is where you can be fossil, near fossil parity. And that's without incentives.
And just to add to that, speaking of sustainable aviation fuel, you also have to be there are only set different pipelines of sustainable aviation fuel around the United States, or aviation fuel in general, and current ASTM standards only allow for up to a 50% blend of SAF into these pipelines. So there's also a kind of standardization regulatory burden to kind of move SAF around. So I don't know. Right now, I'm not sure exactly what would be required. If just increasing it to 100 would be just fine, but the ASTM and other standard makers are trying to make that easier.
I guess you.
Sure. Yeah, this question for Puneet. So
Yeah.
you spoke to carbon containment lab does work on bikers, and also you spoke to liquid fuel
Yes.
applications as well. And just sort of zooming out and thinking about biomass, it's really the best use for it.
Yeah.
Curious if you have perspectives on whether we should be channeling resources towards utilizing it for the carbon value more purely and burial purposes, or as a displacement means the traditional petroleum projects and going more towards fuels applications. So the SAF example, there's some arguments that it's about 2% of our emissions.
Right.
We should continue to burn fossil jet and just focus our efforts on CDR technologies. So can you speak to that from the biomass?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think it very much depends on the LCA that you can do for this process. I think for us, that's still an open question that we're willing to research and determine which pathways make the most sense. When it comes to producing fuels, there's an added burden of the supply chain in the market. With, let's say, bikers and burial, there's showing that your burial is actually robust, right? And showing that when you do a biker's method, that it's going to stay in the ground for hundreds up to 1,000 years. So I agree. I don't have a better answer more than that. That yeah, it's something that we're actively studying. We're doing the LCAs on.
Yeah, and then if I can say one thing about it's an argument I've heard. Well, why don't we just use fossil fuels and do CDR to compensate for each whatever ton of SAF that's burned. It's just who's going to pay for it? Because I think it's a little bit of tragedy of the commons. Is the airline the one that's on the hook to pay for the CDR? And then the cost, even with somewhat optimistic projections, is probably going to be higher, at least from our estimate, than if you can scale e-fuels. So I think there's one is the value chain is more aligned in terms of the person that's paying for the fuel is paying for the decarbonized product, and then also a cost reason.
Other questions? I'll take them to this side of the room. Do you have a question? Yeah.
So, thank you very much. My name is Elijah. I'm an undergrad here at Yale. Back to the torturous path.
Yeah.
I was curious to ask, you're both doctors, but neither of you are in the lab now. Why is it that you're now where you are instead of being still in a university lab or doing R&D in industry and working for some big established energy company?
That's funny. I was just asking them if they missed research earlier,
Okay.
so that's great.
Yeah. So I will say that I'm in the lab every so often. If you count Leah's project as being the lab, being outside and digging holes in the middle of nowhere, Colorado, and burying carbon and then building solar panels to power your instruments. So I still enjoy being in the lab, but I think I also enjoy having a mix, because when you're a PhD student, and I'm just speaking for myself, like being in the lab 24/7 does get old. And so understanding all the different parts of the science, not just like the science, but like how it's used, how it's sold, what are the end of life uses of your end of life cases of your science. I think that's all very important. And that's partly why I decided to go back to school and get my MBA, because I was in the lab a lot and I wanted to see a different world.
Yeah, I still spend a little bit of time in the lab, maybe not as much time as I should. I think, I do love working, and seeing things, physical things, and using my hands. And I think that's part of what is most gratifying for me working, with an early stage startup is, you kind of get to see, from, whether it's taking sort of more management or business sort of side of the venture, or, the nitty gritty of, doing the lab experiments. And like this morning, we were, trying to figure out why the reactor was leaking, so, I still really like that part of it, and I'm definitely not ready to give up the lab work completely yet.
So you talked about woody biomass, and I was just curious as to whether or not could municipal waste be a woody biomass source? I mean, we have a number of waste energy plants. Instead of waste energy, could it be a waste to biofuel kind of process?
Oh, definitely, for sure. Already gasification in a number of areas, like in India, are taking municipal biomass, or municipal waste, and converting that into energy. Now that tends to be lower quality energy.
Yes.
And it always is, one of the big challenges is the consistency and the regularity of your feedstock. I mean, if you can ensure that your feedstock is always of a certain grain size and a certain composition, then your downstream process, designing your downstream process becomes a lot easier. But yeah, absolutely, that's already happening. We focus on woody biomass in particular because we operate a lot in the West, and a lot of that forest clearing produces this woody biomass that is the ultimate end product is CO2 in the atmosphere. So if we can do something with that woody biomass, and one of the pathways could be producing energy, that's why we focus on that.
I'll take one in the back.
Yeah, this one's for me. So Connor had a graph showing the cost of carbon and the cost of decarbonize over time. Beyond the Microsofts of the world, it seems like we're still waiting for people, willing to, buy carbon credits and pay for decarbonization. What do you think needs to happen in order for companies to buy in beyond the frontier coalitions of the world? Is it, the tests that you're doing now with burying and monitoring, verifying? Is it an MRV issue? What do you think needs to happen for that to expand?
All of it. All of it. I mean, after going to Climate Week and the Puro Summit, that was the big question that all the experts were kind of harping about, is just how do we make these markets work? The markets aren't really working. Is it too many suppliers? Is it buyers aren't willing to pay enough? Is it the MRV? And it seemed to be a little bit of everything. One point of view was that there are so many different methodologies and MRVs that it would take you forever to read them all, so there just needs to be less. There was an opinion that there also needs to be consolidation of people producing, offsets because there's just too many, and so because there's too many, the time to validate them all is just too much. And so, honestly, I also think that this is part of any burgeoning market where maybe the barrier to entry is a little bit low. You have a lot of these players coming in, and so there's a lot of confusion in the market, and it takes a while for that market to settle out and standardize. And that's just my personal opinion. I'm still learning a lot about the carbon offset market, but it seems to be a lot of all of what you've mentioned. And then also, there are the bad players, right? You have the cook stove kind of controversy where a lot of cook stove makers were producing bad credits. And just the durability of a lot of these credits are in question. The risk profile is probably in question too. So I think there's just, in a new industry, there's a lot of these different issues that still need time to shake out, unfortunately.
Maybe one question going off of that.
Yeah.
Do you see the government is playing a positive role in trying to kind of push that space into a better area, either through regulation, tax credits, something to that effect?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I would.
What do you think
This
would
is
be
my
equal?
personal view, and not of Carbon Containment Lab. This is my personal view.
Excellent.
But I wish there was a much larger role that government would play to push these markets along. But as you know, like our federal government's going to be the one to make these policies, and it's in gridlock. And so yeah, we've got different credit mechanisms out there for green energy and for use of storage. But yeah, I would agree that government needs to play a larger role. Again, not.
Thank you for your answer and your opinion, which is not reflected in carbon containment. I think we had, sorry, one more question in the front. Did you have a question earlier? Yeah.
Yes. You mentioned about the imbalance between the supply and demand of like captured CO2, and like your Oxylus is like planning to supply carbon both through direct wave capture and also point source capture. And considering point source capture, which sectors do you think is most promising in terms of supplying capture in the near future?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I guess the answer is sort of point source CO2, really the cheapest and purest CO2. You know, that's what any company like ours wants to go after, and where that really is in the United States is biofuel facilities. So these are biogenic CO2 sources, and a lot of them, a lot of the big ones in the Midwest are fuel ethanol facilities. So they're big factories that take corn in one end and produce the ethanol that they blend into the pump. And those facilities produce very pure CO2 streams. There were planned pipelines for the Midwest, but haven't come to fruition, and unclear if they will. And so there's a gold mine of CO2 that's 99% pure, that is really waiting to be utilized. I think those are some of the the first places to go for CO2 utilization. A challenge is most technologies for e-fuel production have big economies of scale, so you need a really big facility to bring the cost down. And that makes it hard because now you're really restricted to industrial facilities that are emitting, a high enough sort of tons of CO2 per day. To pitch Oxylus, our process is more modular, and so we're really trying to target some of these, maybe forgotten about, slightly smaller facilities, especially, in our scale-up journey, where, we believe because our technology is more modular, we can kind of reach lower costs in these facilities compared to incumbent technologies. And then one more thing I'll say, I'm rambling now, but in Europe, the restriction or the regulation is more strict about what qualifies as an e-fuel. So in Europe, the CO2 source must be biogenic. So the CO2 can't be coming from a natural gas or coal facility. It needs to come from a biofuel, right? So that's the European sort of regulation to qualify for the e-fuel credit. In the U.S., it's more, you can use natural gas or fossil-derived carbon.
Good question. I think there's one more over here. I'm not trying to skip over you. With the striped shirt.
Thanks. Firstly, solidarity for having a PhD and never going back to the lab. A perfectly respectable lifestyle choice, I keep telling myself. And following on from what you'd said, Connor, about the pipeline, CO2 pipelines not happening, is there kind of, what's it looking like in the space for kind of carbon dioxide like transport, and how big a barrier is that for basically anything that you guys need to talk about?
That's a good question, and I am not an expert in sort of CO2 transport, so take what I say with a grain of salt. But our sort of general belief is that on-site utilization is the way to go because just gaseous transport is difficult, and so if you need to compress it and truck it away, or ideally build a pipeline, but if that's not happening, then the cost is pretty high. So in our case, if we're able to make a liquid product that's a lot cheaper to transport, there's a big sort of cost advantage. And so that's what we're targeting is on-site utilization. But broadly speaking, outside of Oxylus, I think it's a challenge is, how can we get the CO2 to the places where we can sequester it? Because, where we're producing it is not necessarily the same place where we can pump it underground. So, and we're not going to be able to utilize all the CO2, right? Even if we supply all of the SAF market, there's still a lot of CO2 emissions that need to be sequestered, and that's an important part of the future.
Any other questions? I think I can get maybe one more question, and I'll give the last question to my co-organizer. Hi.
Stupid technical question. I don't know much about green methanol. So you use CO2 to create it, right? How does it burn? What's the byproduct of its combustion or its usage?
Yeah, so when you burn it, it combusts into CO2. So that's kind of where, it's really a CO2 recycling sort of technology. So if we're using the methanol as a fuel, then, at best it's carbon neutral, right? We're taking that CO2 from the atmosphere, burning it, and, ideally that's an infinite loop, and all the electricity that's going in is renewable. But, that's kind of my point is that if we can electrify that, the sector, then we should do it. And it's really only that we should use hydrocarbons where we have to.
Yeah, we just, a few questions ago, we talked about how important government regulation was.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about kind of these international cross-border industrial decarbonization platforms. For example, for aviation, we have Corsia.
Yeah.
And Corsia, it mandates targets for airliners. It stipulates production pathways, whether that's ATJ or Fischer-Tropsch or methyl esters or whatever.
Sure.
So I wanted to understand, what role do you see Corsia, and for marine, it's the IMO GSG platform. How do you see both of these kind of evolving? What role do you think they play today? Is it an opportunity to leverage, or is it something to complain about because they're too lenient or too stifling?
I wouldn't say it's something to complain about. I mean, they've definitely taken the lead on that. I mean, all the airlines are now trying to meet their goals via the Corsia standards. I think what would be helpful is to speed up the accreditation process of different fuels. Right now, as I understand it, most SAF is accredited through their process pathways, and those are all ASTM standards. And just being able to have that standard process and that accreditation move a lot faster would be very helpful, and to be able to expand the blending limitations. You also now, I'm going to throw in other kinds of cross-border groups and standards, like let's say for refrigerants. It's a very interesting interplay between the Paris Agreement, the Montreal Protocol, and then all other international accords that all kind of play together. And it's a really interesting, rich kind of interplay. One of the issues that we're looking at is the Basel Convention, which restricts the movement of of hazardous chemicals. Now, if you're thinking about destruction or reclamation of HFCs, you may want to be able to move HFCs across borders. Let's say if you're in the United States and Mexico has a destruction facility or a reclamation facility, but the Basel Convention currently makes that very difficult. And so these are the things that it's not necessarily good or bad. It had a good reason to exist, but they always need, these aren't frozen in time.
I'll echo what Puneet said. I think, the governing bodies are going to be very critical to pushing forward decarbonized solutions. One thing I'll add is, aside from the regulatory bodies, sort of buyers consortiums are things that I think could really spur, technology companies and producers to scale up. Similar to how renewable energy credits really, the tech industry pushed forward solar deployment. Hopefully there can be a similar way for alternative fuels to be scaled up and to come down the cost curve, is for the folks that have the capital and the willingness to pay to decarbonize will buy those credits for alternative fuels. So that's something that doesn't exist today, but hopeful will get developed.
Okay, thank you so much. So I want to thank the audience for asking such insightful questions, and I want to thank both of our speakers for this really great session. I think that this has kind of sketched out some of the problems and possible solutions from moving from kind of our current state of emitting greenhouse gases to moving towards some kind of net zero value chain, or at least approaching that as a goal. I think after today, we talked about at the beginning that CO2 levels are currently probably above 420 ppm. I've got full confidence that by the next week it's going to be at like pre-industrial levels. So this has been great. Thank you so much.
Also looking for collaborators, so if you're interested in working with the Carbon Containment Lab, please, we'd love to hear from you.
And I'll be down at the poster, so if you want to talk about Oxylus, I'll be in the exhibitor hall. All right, thank you all.
Senator Forum.